Our last section in chapter 44 is all about biomass. And to be honest, I'm going to go relatively quickly through some of these slides because we're not going to go into a ton of detail. When we start getting into biomass calculations and productivity of an ecosystem, we can very quickly get down an ecological rabbit hole. So we're not going to spend too much time here. I just kind of want to set the stage for our next chapter, chapter 45, where we talk about global weather patterns and how that affects the production in an environment. So biomass is going to be the measurement of how much organic matter is present in an ecosystem. And I believe we defined this in the previous video. And then from that, this is related to, biomass production is related to energy production. So of course, primary production is generally photosynthesis. That is the most common, highest energy source coming from photosynthesis. And this is where we convert carbon, inorganic carbon in carbon dioxide, into organic compounds such as glucose. And of course, plants can use glucose as a source of energy. Glucose is a sugar. In an environment, the gross primary productivity is the amount of carbon that is fixed during photosynthesis. So we can essentially think about this as the total amount of energy that is available for any living process. However, plants use some of their energy in order to just survive, to do all of their molecular reactions, to maintain their structures. All of that uses a little bit of energy. And so none of that energy is going to be available to the next trophic level. So instead, ecologists like to look at the net primary productivity. This is your total or your gross primary productivity minus the amount of energy that is lost due to cellular respiration and those cellular processes, because that energy that is used during cellular respiration is not available for any higher trophic levels to pass up. So net primary productivity is essentially the amount of energy that is available for the food web or the food chain. And this is going to be based on the dry weight of an organism, just to avoid fluctuating water contents, because some organisms contain more water, and water is not glucose or energy. So secondary production is energy that is gained in the biomass or stored in the biomass by heterotrophs and decomposers. So secondary production is the energy that those primary consumers and secondary consumers gain from the trophic levels below them. We've already said that that is limited. The total amount of energy in the environment is limited by the primary production that is happening in those primary producers. So that's always going to be dependent on that. But secondary production is that energy that is available for those organisms to perform their metabolic processes. Primary production, or the total amount of energy that's available in any environment, is often limited or influenced by a few important factors. Water is going to limit primary productivity. Temperature, those usually go together, and also nutrient availability. So in terrestrial ecosystems, water is almost always going to be the limiting factor. Temperature plays an important role, but water is almost always the important one. In an aquatic environment, water is always available. So in an aquatic environment, it's usually nutrient availability that is going to be limiting. There's going to be some nutrient missing from that water that limits how much primary production can happen. So in terrestrial systems, increased precipitation or increased water usually means an increased productivity. You're probably all familiar that the tropics or equatorial regions are temperate rainforests or tropical rainforests. These are all areas of increased precipitation, and there are a lot of trees there. That's because the trees help the plants grow. Water is required for photosynthesis. It's also required to help our plants stand up straight and just to perform the functions that are crucial for those plants surviving. Temperature is also an important factor that affects primary production. When we get to our tissue chapter a little bit later, we will talk a bit more about evapotranspiration. Evapotranspiration is the amount of water that is lost through the stomata of a cell due to evaporation. So the stomata are openings in the surface of the leaves that allow gas exchange, carbon dioxide, oxygen, and also water loss. So as it gets warmer, just like you sweat, you lose water due to evaporation. Our plants lose water as well. So the stomata open up, water is pulled out because it's hot, it heats up, and more water in the air will also pull those water molecules out. We'll come back to this. But as the temperature increases, this causes evapotranspiration to increase as well. And what happens here is water is moved through the plant, and that increases photosynthesis because water is required for photosynthesis. So the more water that's getting through the plant, the more the plant can perform photosynthesis. So we have a lot of water because of high precipitation and warm temperatures in our tropical areas. And so our primary productivity is really high because our photosynthesis is just being powered from all directions. Sometimes primary productivity is limited by nutrient availability, nutrients that are in the soil or nutrients that are in the water. The most common nutrients that are going to limit primary productivity are nitrogen and phosphorus. Nitrogen and phosphorus are really important for plants, and they are often relatively scarce in an environment. So if they are scarce, it's going to limit our primary productivity. If they are in good supply, then production is not going to be limited and it will continue. So as I said a minute ago, primary production in aquatic environments is usually limited by nutrients. It's also limited by light. And that's because light can only penetrate to a specific depth in the water. Light is scattered by water, and so it is harder for light rays, light energy to penetrate deep into the water. So at about 1 meter, only half of the solar radiation that's hitting the surface is making its way down to any photosynthetic organisms that happen to be in the water. So this is going to limit the depth of algal growth. So our algae aren't going to grow very deep. And in aquatic environments, we tend not to have as many plants. You might have plants around the shoreline, but once you get past the shoreline, our photosynthesis is going to happen by algae, and those algae are going to be located closest to the surface. Anything below that is not going to have photosynthesis happening. Nitrogen and phosphorus often occur in very low concentrations in water. Every once in a while, we get algae blooms, though, where algae just go crazy because of nitrogen or phosphorus that is added to the water. So this is called eutrophication. Let me start over. Eutrophication. This is where nutrients are put into an environment and basically everything goes crazy. It's kind of a nutrient enrichment. Usually this happens accidentally by farming practices, waste disposal, things like that. But nitrogen and phosphorus can also well up from the bottom. It can be moved out of soil as bacteria in aquatic soils fix that nitrogen, fix that phosphorus, and put it into the water column. So our biomass in abundance is always going to be limited by whatever the scarcest factor is. So you could have plenty of sunlight, but if you have no nitrogen, you're not going to have high primary production. Tropical rainforests often have very high primary production for the reasons we discussed earlier, lots of water, lots of heat. But actually, when you study primary production, we tend to have the highest primary production in temperate zones, where it's not quite as hot, where there's not quite as much water, but there's still enough water to sustain all of the primary production. Primary production is going to decrease towards the poles. We will get into global weather patterns in chapter 45, but as you move towards the poles, it starts to get drier. We will see that there are regions that are still very wet, but then once you get all the way to the poles, it's very cold, very dry. There's not a lot of liquid precipitation. And so what this is going to do is cause that latitudinal gradient in species richness. We talked about this in chapter 44, part 1 video, where we talked about richness and diversity, and we said that as you move away from the equator and towards the poles, your species richness, or the number of species that you find, is going to decrease. And that is partly related to primary production. In aquatic environments, there's very high primary production in coral reefs, coral reef areas. This is because of high temperature and lots of light penetration. But besides areas with coral reefs where you've got them growing because of that high light penetration, tropical oceans generally have very low productivity. If you look at this image, this shows primary productivity. And if we look at our ocean levels, these blue areas, these are our equatorial regions, they actually have relatively low productivity, as indicated by the amount of chlorophyll. So recall from our discussion in Biology 101 about chlorophyll. Chlorophyll is our our energy absorbing molecule that powers photosynthesis. It's relatively low in these regions. But as we get to more temperate zones, our production increases. And this is actually because of something called cold water upwelling. So in cold water upwelling, our warm water is going to fall, our cold water is going to rise, and it essentially makes a cycle, because when the cold water rises from the ocean floor, it brings with it all those nutrients that are down on the ocean floor, that are collecting down there, that are being released by our bacterial decomposers, and cycling it up to the top. And so in temperate areas where we actually have a difference between the temperatures higher up and low, deeper in the water, we actually get more of this cold water upwelling. So while our land production is highest in equatorial regions, our primary production in oceans is actually a little higher away from those equatorial regions, except in areas where there are coral reefs. This just shows you the distribution of biomass by type or group. So plant biomass on Earth is highest, followed by bacteria. And then we've got another circle in the center, another pie chart in the center that shows the distribution of biomass by animal type. And then on the right, we have distribution by different habitat types. So we have the highest biomass in terrestrial areas, marine areas is very, very low, and then deep subsurface. So this is underground. We also have a lot of biomass. That's going to be a lot of our decomposers. So I would encourage you to pause here, just look at this, find some organisms that you recognize, and just look at how they represent our total biomass on Earth.